Hello mga ka-learners! Teacher Angel here. Today we will learn about measuring volume and the same way our ancestors did. Have you ever wondered how things were measured in the past when there were still no standard units of measurement? Can you imagine just how people were able to build houses and other structures without knowing what meters are? How were kerosene, oil, and other liquids measured and sold at that time? You will find the answers to these questions in this lesson. In this lesson, you will learn about some indigenous or native measures of volume. These measures are termed indigenous because they are used only here in our country. This lesson will also enable you to compare measuring instruments used in the past with those used at present. You will also learn the advantages and disadvantages of using indigenous measures. Lastly, this lesson will help you solve problems that are related to ratio and volume. After this lesson, you should be able to use indigenous measures of volume when standard units of measurements are not available and solve problems related to ratios and volumes. Aling Sela has a sari-sari store. She always tells her customers that selling liquids like oil and kerosene were very hard in the past because back then, there were still no standard units of measure. Only the dangkal and dipa were used for measuring length. For measuring items like rice, corn, and other cereals, the ganta, litro, and ochaba were used. Have you heard of similar stories from your parents? The ganta and the litro were made of wood, while the ochaba or chupa was an empty can of milk. Now that we have standard units of measure, rice, corn, and other cereals were sold by the kilogram. 1 ganta of rice is roughly 2 kilograms. Look at the indigenous measures of volume again. If a litro is 1/3 of a ganta, how many litros are there in 1 ganta? If you say 3 litros, then you are right. Our grandparents would usually express it in Spanish as 3 litros. You should probably ask your grandparents about other units of length and volumes which our great-grandparents have used in the past. The ingenuity of the early Filipinos should be appreciated, especially by the younger generation. Their resourcefulness and initiative contributed a lot to the kind of life they had. The use of dipa, dangkal, ganta, and other measures shows us how resourceful our forefathers were. Even in the early stages of our history, Filipinos already engaged in trade, which was known as the barter system. They exchanged goods for other goods with no money involved. Trade flourished even with the use of indigenous measures of volume. Today, even though we already have standard units of measure, some people who live in places where there were no weighing scales still use the indigenous system of measures. They still use biscuit cans for measuring amounts of palay. They use lapad for measuring oil. They use the takal for selling salt, munggo, and corn. What do you think are the disadvantages of using indigenous measures? If you say that these units are not accurate and measurements based on these units are not precise, then you are right. If one uses an indigenous measure, there are more chances of making mistakes because the measurements are not accurate and precise. Let's remember, before standard units of measurements were developed, Filipinos used indigenous measures for determining mass, volume, and length. The ganta, litro, and ochava or chupa were the measures of volume. And that's the end of our module on volume. Did you learn from it? Well, I hope you did because you will definitely need these skills on measuring volume in your day-to-day life. See you on the next module, mga ka-learners!